Oh, hi again. Welcome back. So in this little video, I am going to introduce the functions of each of the macromolecules. Just a very basic introduction to what their main roles are in living things. When we get to the mechanisms that they are involved in, that they're responsible for, that they play crucial key parts in, that's what I'm looking for. Then we will delve more into depth about some of the actual mechanisms and mechanics of how they do the things that they do. So for now, we're just going to worry about what it is that they do. Okay. So if we're looking at carbohydrates, we basically have two main functions for carbohydrates. The first and primary function is that of a short-term energy storage molecule. So living things, when they have the opportunity to gather some free energy from the environment around them, they'd like to hang on to that energy. Sugar is one way in which living things can do that. It's the most prevalent way in which we do it. It's a very efficient, effective way of doing it. Right? And so by taking the energy and using that energy to build these more complex molecules, we effectively store the energy in that molecule. Right? Changes in entropy allow for the distribution of energy, the storage of energy. And when we build something complex, the energy's chilling in that change of entropy. Okay? So things like glucose, fructose, delicious, sweet deliciousness, short-term energy storage. You can break it open, get the energy out. Okay? The other form of carbohydrates are these long, branchy chains of polysaccharides. And these play structural components for many organisms. Right? Cellulose in plants is the first one that comes to my mind. Right? So if you think of a plant, that rigidity of the plant is actually provided by a carbohydrate. It's these long interlinked chains of cellulose that give it that nice rigid structure. Right? So they overlap on each other. There's not much movement. Right? It's kind of like if you think of like a phone book, right? Like an individual piece of paper isn't very solid, right? But you put a bunch of them together and it gets pretty solid, right? That's how this stuff works. Another example would be chitin, the things that make bug shells, right? So think about how tough a bug shell is. That's made out of carbohydrates as well. When I say bug, I mean insect, right? Science. Okay, so we have a structural function and a energy storage function for carbohydrates. When we're looking at lipids, we have also a structural function and an energy storage function. Okay. So if we think about the structure of lipids compared to the structure of carbohydrates, right, these lipids have a lot more of those carbon-hydrogen bonds than did the carbohydrate. Right? And so these lipids can actually store a lot more energy than the carbohydrates do. However, they're a lot harder to break down. Right? And so lipids are really useful for storing energy if you don't need the energy right now. If I have a large excess of energy coming in and I don't need it, I'm going to store it as some lipids, some fats. So fats and oils are this genre of lipids, storage for energy. Right? Oils also sometimes play roles in living things for lubrications, right? Dispersal of things from our body, such as the oil that comes out of my face. Right? But very often it's an energy storage thing for like plants. Right? There are two structures that we need to concern ourselves within the lipids. Okay? And so within the carbohydrate chains, or rather the hydrocarbon chains of the lipids, right? If they are all single bonds, we call that a saturated fat. Okay? If you find a double bond within that chain, that is an unsaturated fat. Okay? Saturation in this sense is talking about the amount of hydrogens attached to the carbons. Okay? So if you have all single bonds, you have the most hydrogen that those carbons can hold. That double bond means there's one less hydrogen involved for each of the carbons. Right? So there's two less hydrogens around. Okay? It's unsaturated. The structural importance for this is that saturated fats will pile up on themselves. Right? They do stuff like clog your arteries. Whereas unsaturated fats, like they won't link together as nicely, so they kind of bounce off each other and they don't fit nicely, so they're more free floating. Okay? So saturated fats at room temperature will tend to be solid fats, whereas unsaturated fats at room temperature will be liquid fats. And the last group of lipids that I'm going to talk about are the steroids. Okay? Completely different function from the energy storage aspect of it. The steroids are what our bodies use to communicate. They're cellular communication, right? Hormones are an example of steroids. Right? And so these steroids float around our body, and they send messages from one part to another. So if my pituitary gland releases a message that says, hey, you thirsty, drink something, I'll drink something. Right? Cool. Hormone-y stuff. Right? Steroids, very cool stuff. Lipids. Now, all lipids are non-polar, which is important for their role as steroids, right? You don't want your hormones breaking down along the way, right? So if they're non-polar, they're hydrophobic, the water won't get them all messed up, right? Our cellular membranes are composed of lipids because they're hydrophobic. So our cells can maintain their structure because of the non-polar nature of these lipids, which we will talk about in depth when we get to cell structure and cell function. Next group is nucleic acids. Okay? So these are DNA, RNA, which is one group, and ATP, which is another group. There's also GTP, which I might mention at some point in the class, but I might not because it doesn't matter really. If you understand ATP, you understand how GTP works too, just a different variation. Anyway, I digress. The RNA and the DNA are used as messenger molecules. They store genetic information. Right? The variation in the nitrogenous base, right, along with the uniform nature of their outer levels, what we call the sugar phosphate backbone, right, make them an ideal messenger storage unit for information. Right? The variation in the letters work like a code. Literally like the same way that our words work, that's how these things work. Okay? You have different variations in these letters, you get different instructions. The ATP, vastly different role in the whole biological world. The ATP is an energy molecule, right? And so it's smaller than a sugar. So this is like really instant energy. If you need it right now, ATP is what our cells go to actually do work. Right? So all the things that our cells do are powered by ATP. If it needs to throw something out, okay, boom, and it needs energy to do that, it uses ATP. The sugar is too big for the cell to use mechanically because the cell parts are small. So it needs small driving stuff. Right? That's a cellular respiration topic we'll talk about in depth during cellular respiration. And finally, we got proteins. Okay? Proteins are really cute, so sexy, so variable in their myriad of functions. Okay? So the proteins, when the amino acids start coming out and linking together, the R groups can interact with each other, and they form these very complex different shapes. You got like beta sheets and helixes, right? And they just make these big balls. Okay? These big balls of amino acids also have some of their unused R groups sticking out. Okay? And so whatever R groups are sticking out, those provide the chemical properties of the protein, right? And so if this is a hydrophobic R group, this region of that protein is going to be hydrophobic, right? If it's an acidic R group sticking out, that region is going to be acidic. So these proteins can have so many different combinations of characteristics. They can do so many different things, and they're just fantastic. And we will talk about proteins when we talk about genetics. Okay, so that was just an introduction to the basics of their functions. That went a little bit longer than I expected, but you're welcome. I'll see you next time. Bye.